by way of introduction, my name is Sue Orloff. I'm a wildlife biologist by profession. But when I retired, I started my own nonprofit called Biologists Without Borders. Support wildlife conservation. And our co-presenter today is Wendy Hapgood. She's the co-director of another conservation nonprofit called Wild Tomorrow. And she's also a professor of sustainability at Columbia University. I mean, we've been working together for the last 10 years or so, but primarily on African wildlife conservation. And Wendy's going to tell you a little bit more about what Wild Tomorrow does at the end of all of our talks, so stay tuned. And although our primary work has been in African wildlife conservation, we've seen firsthand that the most serious threat to wildlife, not to mention the planet, is climate change. So we've broadened our scope to include that in our mission as well. And today, Wendy's going to be talking about how biodiversity loss is interconnected with climate change and our food systems. And I'll be addressing the critical role our food choices play in reducing our carbon footprint. And I know most of you already know the importance of food choices, but I'll be sharing some insights that might surprise you. And we'll also be showing, hopefully, a 4-minute animated film, award-winning, that addresses the dangers of climate change in an entertaining and somewhat comical manner, and I think you'll enjoy that. And our special guest speaker today is Micheal Grunwald. He's an investigative journalist, best-selling author. He's a former staff writer for Politico and Washington Post and Time Magazine. And we're very happy to have Micheal here today to talk about his new book, We Are Eating the Earth. Provocative title, and it's about the unsustainability of our current agricultural food system and how fixing it is actually the key to the climate crisis. And he's also going to be sharing some hopeful insights for the future as well. And his books are on sale outside in the lobby at the end of the presentations. And we'll have a question and answer period at the end of all of our presentations. So please save your questions and answers until the end. And right now, please welcome Wendy Hapgood.
Thank you, Sue, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Hapgood. I'm the co-founder of Wild Tomorrow. We're a wildlife conservation organization dedicated to protecting threatened and endangered biodiversity by saving and restoring the habitats they call home. I'm really excited to be here in the virtual room with you all today as part of San Francisco Climate Week. Before I begin, I wanted to show a really quick video to put nature back in the room and shine a light on our food system and its really important impact on climate and biodiversity. It's a pangolin.
Woo.
I think everybody in the room knows that we are losing nature at really rapid rates. We are facing the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth, and this time it's not caused by an asteroid, it's caused by us. But there is still hope. There's time to turn this around by protecting and restoring habitat, which really requires rethinking our food system. Nearly all of the habitat loss around the world is driven by one thing, which is the expansion of agriculture. This is not new. We are a very successful species. And we've really fundamentally changed our relationship with nature to one of domination. I think you could say we are the super predator on the very top of the food chain. And this, I believe a picture tells 1,000 words. This is actually from our area of focus in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. It's one of the world's 36 global biodiversity hotspots. So located within one of those hotspots, which is a place, these hotspots are places on Earth that are home to the most diverse life on Earth, biodiversity, and very threatened biodiversity. So these are places on the planet that we really should choose to protect. And what you're seeing here is industrial agriculture. This is pineapple fields, right? Monoculture pineapple fields, literally on the edge of a UNESCO World Heritage Wetland Park. And then what you see actually here on the edge and back here is the land that Wild Tomorrow is working on saving, habitat, like acre by acre, creating a nature reserve for threatened biodiversity. All the wildlife you love from the Lion King, that's what lives here. So I would say, I love pineapples, but we all need to eat, but this is maybe not the best place for it. And that story plays out on a global scale. I love Our World in Data. It's a great resource. And what this data is showing us is how much of the world that was once covered by forest and wetlands and wildlands that is now being used for agriculture. So you can see of the actual habitable land of our planet, which is here, the unhabitable land is what is covered in ice and is desert landscape. So what it's showing is that the majority of actually habitable land on our planet today, 45% is already being used for agriculture. And if you look at that 45%, 80% of that is used for livestock, meat, dairy. So most of half the planet we're using for agriculture, 80% of that half is being used for livestock. And so that's why tackling what we eat and how we produce our food that's why it plays such a key role in tackling not just climate change, but also reducing water stress, pollution, and saving our planet's threatened biodiversity. So how bad is it for wildlife? Well, about half of the Earth's animals have been lost in the last 50 years. That's almost not quite my lifetime. I'm not 50 yet. But that's pretty shocking to me that we've lost 50% of wild animals in just the space of my lifetime. So I ask you to consider these facts. 96% of the mass of animals on our planet today is us and the animals that we raise to eat, 96%. The rest is everything else, from mice to elephants to bats to raccoons. You add up their weight altogether, that's just 4% of the total mass of mammals on our planet. Only 4% is wild. If we look at the feathered world, 70% of the mass of birds on our planet today are poultry, mostly chickens. And this one really shocked me. I love my cats and dogs. If we added up the weight of our dogs and cats that we have as pets, that would weigh the same as all the wildland mammals combined. You add up the weight of every elephant and rhino and more bats, mice on this planet, that adds up to the same weight as our dogs and cats. So it's really, really crazy, I think, it's a stark reminder of how we've been so successful taking up space on this planet, but really crowding out space for wildlife. And as David Attenborough said in A Life on Our Planet, we have replaced the wild with the tame, which is what we're seeing here. Our impact on the natural world has been immense. particularly because of what we choose to eat, which is the subject of Micheal's book. This is a picture, a beautiful photo I came across on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, which really took my breath away. It's an award-winning photo, and 2025 Nature Photographer of the Year award for a Brazilian photographer. And this is the Cerrado biome. It's the richest savanna in the world with over 10,000 plant species. And I think when we think of food and we think of Brazil, we think about the loss of the Amazon rainforest and the biodiversity that's impacted there and the people. But today, 46% of Brazil's grassland and savanna ecosystems have also been converted. Agriculture, particularly cattle ranching and soy, and burning of vegetation for charcoal is what has caused this conversion. And it's a major threat to this like super beautiful, almost otherworldly, I would say, landscape. So how does this habitat destruction impact wildlife? We can take elephants as an example. I like to say they're like starter drugs for conservationists because everybody loves elephants. Who wouldn't want to help elephants? And at least it's the issues for elephants are different across countries, but in South Africa, it's space that is the key threat. A lack of space is the key threat to elephant populations and enabling them to recover. They actually were upgraded in conservation terms, which is not a good thing, to endangered a few years ago. So African savanna elephants are officially considered endangered. And in South Africa, it's really because of a lack of wild spaces. They need more space and they need those spaces to be connected by corridors. So even in these really large wildlife reserves that are fenced, they run out of space and vets have to contracept them. I don't know if you know that. I found that quite interesting. They're from the air and helicopters giving them birth control to try to control the population because they've run out of space. We were involved, just so you know, the elephant is alive, it's tranquilized. This was something we were involved in a few years ago, helping a big project to move 53 elephants. So this one and her family, 53 of them moved because they ran out of space. They were moved, they couldn't even find space within South Africa. They were moved to Mozambique. And so we really have to figure out, to help elephants and other species, we have to figure out how to stop agricultural expansion, farm more on the land that we already farm if we're going to stop extinction. And it's really so we can give wildlife some space to breathe, like literally. And so I think all of us probably know this image of Earth taken from space in 1968, the Earthrise image. We look at that and you can see that Earth is finite. It has its limits. This is it. I like the saying, there is no planet B. And if you're Katy Perry, maybe you feel like when you went up in space that you're not connected to nature, but we are all part of nature. We are not outside of nature. And it is our life support system, planet Earth. It's the only one we have, and we can't have nature if we don't leave space for nature. Nature is finite. Nature needs protecting. So ensuring that everybody can eat sustainably is truly one of the most significant challenges that faces humanity and the planet and all the species we share it with. So with that note, I'm going to pass it over to Sue Orloff, and then after that to Micheal.
Probably preaching to the choir here, but it's become painfully clear, at least to me, that we can't rely on either politicians or industry to act quickly enough to help fix the climate crisis. I mean, by the time most politicians come around to even acknowledging there is a problem, Manhattan will be underwater along with most of the coastal cities. And we all know the major players, the culprits to blame. But the role of livestock, particularly cattle, in the climate crisis is seldom addressed. Most environmental NGOs don't even want to talk about it for fear they'll be offending their supporters' food choices and therefore lose funding. And rightfully so. It's a touchy subject. if you want to take a deep dive, there's a Netflix documentary called Cowspiracy. And I think some of you are saying you've seen it. It's very eye-opening. It's basically the elephant in the room. Talking about eating less meat is like the third rail of climate activism, but we're going to talk about it today. As you probably know, the beef industry is very powerful, and they're spending lots of money right now spreading misinformation about environmentally friendly beef. Sort of similar to what the tobacco industry did back in the day when cigarettes were under scrutiny. They were trying to make cigarette smoking sexy, and the beef industry is trying to convince us that cattle can be climate friendly and lead happy lives. This is an ad in the 90s. This kind of marketing can be quite compelling. Even climate activists can be persuaded or at least seduced into denial. But it's widely recognized by leading experts that reducing our meat consumption is one of the most impactful things we can do as individuals to help fight the climate crisis. So it's become increasingly important that we at least talk about it. But if even climate activists find this hard to hear, imagine persuading the general public. So we need a kinder, gentler, more palatable, if you will, way of communicating. And to this end, we have produced a 4-minute animated short called The Straight Poop. And it's an engaging way of addressing the dangers of climate change that educates as well as entertains. And our film has already received over 20 domestic and international film awards. So I hope you enjoy.
In a time not too different from our own, the human race confronted a threat to its very existence. And this terrifying threat appeared, as they often do, in the most innocent and improbable of places.
Dude, stop! You're messing up my home with all your pooping. Not to mention the constant annoying burping. In fact, you're messing up the entire planet. Ever hear of climate change? Surely you've noticed how summers are getting unbearably hot. But you probably don't know that your digestive processes spew out huge amounts of methane. Ugh, that's a greenhouse gas way worse than carbon dioxide. And there are so many of you.
Come on, it's not that bad.
Really? Our planet is burning up. Just let me show you something. Come with me. My electric energy jetpack, go!
Wow. Am I in heaven?
No, silly. That's the Earth down there. You know, the place we all live?
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah, but look. Here's a scary fact. Almost half the habitable land on Earth is used to raise and feed livestock.
No way.
Oh, you think that's bad? Check this out.
Where are we now?
The Amazon rainforest.
But where's the forest?
Exactly! It's disappearing fast. The fact is, livestock farming is the cause of 80% of Amazon rainforest destruction, and it keeps getting worse each year.
Whoa!
Let me show you something else. I bet you didn't know that livestock produce about the same amount of greenhouse gases as all the world's cars, trucks, ships, and planes combined. Whoa! And if you cows alone were a country, you'd be third in the world in greenhouse gas emissions, right after China and the US.
Holy cow!
Yeah, and people are eating more beef every year!
This is all really scary, but what to do?
I think it's up to them!
You can be part of the solution to this source of methane pollution. Mother Earth would heave a sigh of relief if people would just eat less meat. Especially beef, that's what to do, and it's up to you.
So although the film is rather humorous, the information is based on well-researched data, and it makes a weighty subject accessible and enjoyable for all ages. In fact, it would be great to show to school kids who probably have more open minds to these facts than their adult parents and might even be able to influence them. So, what are the facts? Some of you probably already know some of these. There are approximately 1.5 billion cows on the planet today, almost one for every 5 people. They basically take up a lot of space. And as shown in the film, and it really bears repeating, animal agriculture produces about the same amount of greenhouse gases as the entire global transportation sector. And that's primarily from cattle. This astounds even my most avid environmentalist friends. And it's mostly the cow's 4-chambered stomach that ruminants have, fermenting all those gases, and methane is among them. And methane is the main culprit. It's 80 times more powerful than CO2. And although it's more powerful, it dissipates a whole hell of a lot faster, like in around 10 years, as opposed to CO2 that can take hundreds of years to get out of the atmosphere. So cutting methane emissions is the fastest, most effective way we know to immediately slow the rate of global warming. It's our silver bullet. And of course, that's tied to what we eat. And as we all know, nobody likes to be told what to eat, even from a young age. Everybody's willing to buy EVs and expensive solar arrays, but eating less meat is often just a bridge too far. And I got to thinking why this might be, and I did a little bit of a deep dive and put on my psychologist hat, came up with a few things. Some of this is intuitive. Meat consumption is traditional in many cultures, linked to personal identity, social status, and masculinity. And indeed, studies have shown that men do eat more meat than women across many cultures, especially in wealthier countries. But interestingly, a recent study has shown that in countries with more gender equality, the gap between men and women becomes even more pronounced. So it seems that, like, when women are given a choice to choose what they choose to eat less meat. And here's a fact that I came up with, which astounded me. Half the beef in America is eaten by only 12% of the population. And that's mostly middle-aged men. So if one were developing meat reduction strategies, you might do well to look into some of these studies. Now, I'm not trying to guilt trip anybody. Guilt tripping is never productive. And a meatless diet is obviously not for everyone. But the idea of eating a little less meat, I think it's much more tolerated. And even a little change can make a big difference. And people might say, well, what's one person changing their diet going to do to save the planet? Well, you can also say that about your vote. What's one vote going to do? But if more of those voting skeptics actually voted, I don't think we'd be in the pickle we're in today. And most importantly, I'll drag the Dalai Lama into this. Social action is contagious. If many of us begin to eat less meat and we talk about it constructively with our friends, we're likely to influence them. And as we all know, time is running out. It's an all solutions on deck moment for humanity. And for our food systems, we just can't rely on feed additives and maximizing yields or regenerative agriculture. All these are going to take some time, if they work at all. Michael's going to go into depth on a lot of these. But eating less meat can have an immediate effect. It's basic supply and demand. Our choices drive markets. If a rancher in the Amazon sees that the demand for his beef has gone down, he's much less likely to expand his operations. Plus, I think it can be rather empowering for people to know that they can make a significant impact by doing something as simple as eating less meat. And if we haven't moved you, perhaps my favorite ecologist will. So, the wildlife and domestic animals, thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to the man of the hour right now. Please welcome Micheal Grunwald.
Oh, thanks so much, Sue and Wendy. That was really great. I think we're all preaching from the same hymn book here. But I really appreciate all the good work you're doing. Look, as both of you have pointed out, and it says in big bold letters on the bright orange cover of my book, we are eating the earth. And I was at the Washington Post. I was around, Bob Woodward and Dana Priest and Bart Gellman and all these great investigative reporters. I'm not one of them. I more specialize in kind of big, dumb, Captain Obvious ideas that are hidden in plain sight. And this is one of them that you see every time you take a cross-country flight and you look out and see all those circles and squares. You can see that there is a lot of agriculture out there. And that's my big dumb idea, that there's a lot of agriculture out there, that agriculture is eating the earth, right? I mean, most of us live in cities and suburbs. They cover about 1 of every 100 acres of habitable land on the planet. Farms and pastures cover 2 out of every 5, about 40%. We are losing a soccer field worth of forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. It all adds up to a land mass about the size of all of Asia plus all of Europe that we're using to grow our food. We are on track to deforest another dozen Californias worth of land by 2050 to feed the world. And we just don't have another dozen Californias worth of forest to spare. So this is really, this is the story. It's the story of our natural planet becoming an agricultural planet. That's really the story of our species. We can see it today and we point our fingers and say it's terrible what's happening in the Amazon, it's terrible what's happening in Indonesia, and it is. But remember, like Indiana used to be 85% forest, right? We already deforested our Amazon. So this is really a global phenomenon. And agriculture is the biggest environmental story on Earth. It's the blob that's overrunning everything. It uses 70% of our fresh water. So that's why the aquifers are under California are parched. That's why the Colorado River is running dry. Agriculture is the leading driver of water pollution, right? The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, that's the size of Connecticut. You have these horrible algal blooms that are just sort of suffocating the Great Lakes. And yes, the theme of today is that it is the leading driver of biodiversity loss because it is the leading driver of deforestation and wetland destruction and grassland destruction. there have been a lot of really good books about this sixth extinction that Wendy mentioned. It's an agriculture extinction, right? That is what is driving, that's what's taking away the land, it's taking away the habitat, and it's taking away the animals. So you're not just eating a cow, you're eating macaws and jaguars and the rest of the cast of Rio. You're eating the Amazon. And as Sue really got into, you're also, this is really a climate story as well. The food system is now about a third of our emissions. Agriculture directly is about a quarter of our emissions. And yes, some of that is crop dusters and other diesel tractors, other fossil fueled farm equipment that spew carbon dioxide. Some of it is the burping and farting cows. And yes, some of it is fertilizer, right? Which is actually about 2.5% of global emissions. Most of our fertilizer is literally made out of natural gas. But this is mostly about clearing land for agriculture, right? You have a forest, you have a wetland, it stores a lot of carbon, you get rid of it to farm it. And that is a huge carbon loss right there. Decarbonizing the planet while continuing to vaporize forests for agriculture, it's like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room, right? Not only are you making this huge mess, right, and that's from the initial carbon loss, you're also losing these forests and wetlands that are so good at cleaning up the mess, that absorb carbon that our fossil fuels have already put into the sky. So again, it used to be, you kind of had to lead with biodiversity and say like, hey, it's not just, these things we're doing are not just hurting the critters, they're hurting us. But now, of course, climate has gotten a little sexier, right? It's that word is on the cover of my book, not biodiversity. So I always try to point out, and I don't have to describe, but it's hurting the critters too, not just us. And here again, it's not just when we say agriculture is eating the earth, and Wendy mentioned this, but it's really livestock that are eating the earth. Right? We said already 40% of the land on Earth is agriculture. Well, 80% of that 40% is either pastures or it's crops that animals eat before we eat them. So that's about a third of the planet is devoted to our livestock. And again, as you heard David Attenborough say, right, eating plants is just a lot more efficient than eating animals that eat plants. It takes about 9 calories of plants into a chicken to get 1 calorie of meat, because you have to provide energy and support feathers and beaks and clucking and pooping. And cattle are way worse than poultry or pork. They use, and this is the next slide, they use way more land per calorie and about 10 times more emissions per calorie. And again, so this is like, since it is really cattle that are the problem, so dairy is really quite bad, but at least, dairy cows produce milk several times a day. Beef cattle produce beef like once in their lifetime. So that's really the baddie. In the United States, we use half of our agricultural land to grow beef, and beef provides about 3% of our calories. And again, Wendy waved at this, but livestock around the world now weigh about 30 times more than wild mammals. They've really taken over. So that's our biodiversity problem. And, we do vote on these issues 3 times a day. We ate 400 million tons of meat last year as a species. So you can see what we're voting for. And one obvious solution is to try to eat less, and especially less beef. I would point out that it's really hard, not just because of the psychological reasons that Sue pointed out, but it's delicious, right? Our ancestors started eating meat about 2 million years ago, and we literally evolved to enjoy the taste, right? That's when we started getting, the bigger brains to try to find meat and the smaller stomachs because, we didn't need to digest as many plants. Vegan activists have been telling us for years that meat is murder. They've been showing us the documentaries about the horrible treatment of animals inside factory farms. They've been yelling at us, shaming us, educating us, and every year we're eating more meat. I interviewed a pollster. You think about maybe there's some kind of public policy we can use to reduce meat consumption. This pollster told me that taxes on meat or any restrictions on meat eating are literally the least popular policy he has ever polled in the United States. His joke was that it was like veterans benefits for ISIS. So look, change is possible. Actually, in the United States, over the last half century, we eat about a third less beef per capita. But again, this isn't because we decided to all do the right thing and save the climate. It's because chicken got a lot cheaper because of industrial production. And a lot of people think it's healthier. And so that's why, yes, there are 1.5 billion cows on Earth. There are 70 billion chickens on Earth. And it is, that switch from beef to chicken has probably done more to help the climate than anything Americans did before the rise of solar. Obviously, it sucks for the chickens. But again, it shows that our diets, they are not set in stone. They are changeable. But again, as a species, we seem to be not that great at making big sacrifices for the planet. But really good at inventing stuff, which is why I have a couple, I think, kind of fun and then at times sort of sad chapters in my book about the rise and fall and potential rise again of alternative meats, which are really the closest analogy we have to alternative energy like wind and solar. And it really is going to be vital to develop substitutes that taste as good and cost as little as animal carcasses. Obviously, we're not quite there yet. But, we're starting to see not just the plant-based meat, but you're going to see cultivated meat made from animal cells. And you can already find the mycoprotein, the fungi-based meat. And again, it uses about 80% less land, 80% fewer emissions than animal corpse meat. Another way we can help is, we waste a quarter of our food, which means we waste a quarter of the land we use to grow our food. We use a landmass the size of China to grow garbage. So again, there's a lot we can do to try to waste less. And if I were smart, I'd probably just stop there and everybody would be happy. Oh, we got to stop eating the earth. We got to all buy Grunwald's book. But I do want to make another point about agriculture and biodiversity that's a little more controversial. Because if we want to eat less of the earth, we need to improve how our food is produced as well as consumed. And that means we're going to need to make more food with less land and less mess. And that can have some uncomfortable implications, right? The polite technocratic way to make this point would just be to say that agriculture's impacts on the environment mostly depend on how extensive it is, not how intensive it is, right? It's about how far the world's agricultural footprint expands and overruns biodiverse wildernesses, not how much agricultural intensification impacts the richness of our soils. But I'll be a little less polite. You've all read too much Michael Pollan. You're buying too much bullshit about the sustainable magic of regenerative agriculture. You think the problem is industrial agriculture and factory farms when it's mostly just agriculture and farms. Agriculture had eaten an entire South America worth of the earth before the Industrial Revolution, and it had eaten 2 South Americas before the Green Revolution, which really brought the sort of high-tech, not just high-tech seeds, irrigation, factory farms, modern chemicals, fertilizers, brought that into and really created modern agriculture today. So really the environmental movement and now the climate movement has ignored agriculture for just way too long, right? Except for the kind of sexy, politically enticing targets like pesticides and GMOs that actually have very little to do with agriculture's environmental impact. And now they're really glomming on to these again, politically alluring farming fantasies that aren't backed by science, right? They're lapping up documentaries like Carbon Cowboys and Kiss the Ground that tell you that that we can, just by farming a little more kinder and gently, or a little more gentle, that really we can sort of repatriate all that bad carbon that we pumped up into the sky, can kind of miraculously return as good carbon in agricultural soils. And that notion of carbon farming is almost entirely bogus. It's just really hard to measure how much carbon gets sequestered in the soil. It's even harder to make sure the sequestered carbon stays in the soil. In any case, we're learning that you really can't get much more carbon into soils without dumping more nitrogen on those soils. And that means more nitrous oxide that warms the climate, and more nitrates, pollution that destroys our rivers and lakes. So, I just, as an example, there's one famous study of a regenerative ranch in Georgia. It was financed by General Mills, which gives you a sense of sort of all the greenwashing that's happening here, and declared that this ranch was carbon neutral, which is kind of weird, right? Because we've just heard about how bad beef are for the climate. And when you look into the details, they just ignore the importance of land. There's just a little footnote that says, by the way, this wonderful carbon neutral ranch uses almost 3 times as much land per calorie or gram of beef as a conventional ranch. And so you can imagine, if you transformed all of America's ranches to that kind of approach, you would need about 6 more Texases worth of land to support all the cows. And you can just imagine the biodiversity impacts there. So again, this is one of my big messages of the book, is that we have forgotten about the importance of land. We have treated land as if it were free. We have forgotten its importance. We've treated it like it doesn't matter. Because what we really need is more productive agriculture that makes even more food per acre. Because that way we wouldn't need as many acres to make the same amount of food. Now, I should say that doesn't necessarily mean only factory farms or industrial agriculture, but it does mean high yield agriculture. When I went to Brazil, I saw some degraded ranches where you'd see like 1 cow for every 5 or 7 acres, and the cows looked like they were on hunger strike. It was just terrible. And then you'd see some improved ranches where they had spent maybe $1,000 an acre or so, and they had a cow on every acre. That meant they were using 1/5 as much of the Amazon or the Cerrado. They were eating 1/5 as much of the earth. Now look, these ranches, some of them, they did use some industrial practices, right? They fertilized their pastures. Boo, terrible. They had feedlots. I know Michael Pollan hates that. And it certainly wasn't grass-fed beef, right, that spend their entire life on pasture. But it turns out that grass-fed beef is actually worse for the planet and the climate, partly because it takes them longer to get to slaughter weight, so they're alive longer to burp and fart methane, but partly because they just use way more land. But what I saw on some of these ranches that have been upgraded and had really kick-ass yields were plenty of regenerative practices where they were doing mob grazing, that sort of, they move the cows from paddock to paddock, which is, really kind of mimics the migrations of natural ruminants on the plains. They planted cover crops, they did no-till, they allowed the cattle to integrate and graze on some of those cover crops. And again, so what matters wasn't necessarily how they were doing it. I'm kind of agnostic on that. But what really matters is that the yields are great. And just globally, organic agriculture tends to get 25 to 40% lower yields. And that means it uses 25 to 40% more land for whatever they're making. And, we saw what happened in Sri Lanka, where they decided to go all organic. They banned agrochemicals, and within 6 months, their yields crashed. They had dramatic food shortages. They had food riots. The government fell. The president had to flee the country. It's not the it's not the right approach. And so again, I've seen, working on this book, I've seen really dozens of incredibly promising solutions that can make farming both more productive and also less destructive. I should say that none of them really have a ton of traction yet, but I've seen alternative fertilizers where they're editing the genes of microbes to snatch nitrogen out of the air so that you don't have to dump all this nasty chemical fertilizer onto fields that then ends up washing into the Gulf of Mexico. I saw alternative pesticides where they used the RNA technology behind the COVID vaccines to literally constipate potato beetles to death. It was incredible at the University of Illinois. They are reinventing photosynthesis, right? This is a technology that's been working pretty well for the last 3 billion years, maintaining all life on Earth, but turns out to be pretty inefficient for making crops. And so they are engineering out some of those efficiencies using artificial intelligence and gene editing and big data. And they think they can increase crop yields 50% over the next 20 years. On the cattle side, I've seen gene edited heat tolerant cattle. You do see these feed additives to help the cows burp less methane. Again, there are a lot of exciting potential solutions, but as a species, we have not really committed to trying to solve these problems. And I do think some of it, particularly on the agricultural production side, is just that we've sort of internalized these ideas that, Michael Pollan is just the best writer who talks about it, but it's really throughout our culture, this idea that the real environmental tragedy of agriculture is the transformation of these pastoral, rustic farms where, the animals have names instead of numbers, and, the soil is treated with love, and the farmers wear overalls and they look like that American Gothic painting. And we've sort of intensified them into these horrible chemical drenched monocultures and these automated factory farms that are, treat animals like widgets and dump their poop all over the place. And I don't want to pretend that there's no environmental loss from that intensification. I just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a few weeks ago about why our rivers are turning into sewers. And it's because we don't regulate factory farms like we regulate factories. But the kind of inconvenient truth about this stuff is that the real environmental tragedy of agriculture is the initial transformation of nature into those rustic Michael Pollan farms. That's when we lose the carbon. That's when we lose the biodiversity. And so that means that if we are going to solve these problems, we really do need not only new technologies, not only new land policies, but we need a new land ethic, a real idea of how are we going to make the most out of every acre. And I know in some ways it almost sounds like these kind of, rapacious, kind of consultants who are trying to dredge dollars out of the dirt. It sounds kind of robotic, and efficiency doesn't really sound like a kind of human value. But these are really moral issues, right? By, just in Africa alone, if we don't increase yields over the next 30 years, we are on track to have enough deforestation in Africa that even if we stop using fossil fuels worldwide and stop deforestation everywhere else, we would still blow past 2 degrees Celsius as a species and heat up the earth and move past our Paris climate targets just from deforestation in Africa. So again, I want people to think that these ideas that sometimes people accuse me that I'm shilling for factory farms or I'm an apologist for fertilizers and pesticides, but really, making more food. The people who say we don't need to do it usually aren't hungry, and they usually aren't living in the ecosystems that get cut down when we need to make more food. So again, this is really a question of how do we do right by smallholder farmers in Africa, who are some of the poorest people on earth, indigenous people in the Amazon who lived in a former carbon sink that's turned into a carbon source, vulnerable people in the floodplains of Bangladesh. These are all going to be affected by rising seas and climate change and heat waves and floods. And so are the orangutans and the birds and the bees and the other species that we share this amazing planet with. It really is, it's the only planet we've discovered that's got pizza and reliable Wi-Fi and breathable air. We're not gonna get this done on Mars. We got to fix this planet, and I really think rethinking the way we do vote on these issues 3 times a day. We're going to have to shift our voting patterns, and we're also going to have to shift the way we actually use the land on this planet. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Wendy, and then I hope we can take some questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. I'm just going to share my screen again. Make sure your book's there front and center. Thank you again so much for expertly and so passionately explaining, your main findings in your book, which took, was it 5-6 years of research? So really, it's a really enlightening read and such an important book as well. So we can really, especially as conservationists, I think, understand some of these systemic drivers and make sure we're focused on the right things. Just before we get to Q&A, I wanted to show this picture because, as Michael said, we need to stop eating the earth. We need to save those wild places that are still left if we're going to have any chance of saving not just the climate, but also our planet's precious biodiversity. What you see here is a part of our reserve in South Africa. On the left is actually, you can actually kind of see the rows. That was pineapple fields some time ago. And now, although you don't see them in this picture, there's, a lot of wildlife there. So we are not protecting what is left, but also restoring degraded farmland that to kind of fight back for nature and create space. But obviously, it's actually also very expensive to do. So the best thing we can do is stop the deforestation in the first place, and then protect, and then, of course, restore habitat as well. And what you're seeing here is one of my favorite photos. These are beautiful giraffe calves born on the land that was degraded farmland, that was pineapples. And, to see them, it is a lot of gloom and doom, obviously, with anything environmental these days, but to see this regeneration, we're part of the rewilding movement, is very hopeful to witness life return to these places that had been, cleared in the past for farming. So just wanted to say, we are the generation that knows, we have the knowledge, the tools, the finance to really protect biodiversity, reverse climate change. We need to have, the facts, but also the inspiration and huge amount of political will to do it, and to follow this path that Michael illuminates in his book through better policy and not just production, but also consumption. With that, I'm going to hand back, stop sharing, and we're going to unmute you guys. So we can get to Q&A. I'm sure you want to quiz Michael in particular, but obviously myself and Sue as well. Do we have... Oh, here we go. We have a question from Raghav. Sometimes I feel like information facts don't convince people as much. Lots of cognitive dissonance, indeed. Even in San Francisco Climate Week, no one talks... not many talks are focused on animal agriculture. So what are your thoughts, Michael? Making the right choice, the easy choice, like making default plant-based options in school cafeterias, universities, hospitals, healthy as well, cities, and then what are the 3 things we can all do to help catalyze that change?
I love the mention of these nudges and the defaults. I actually wrote a story about the New York City hospitals, where they have made plant-based options the default. So, they send somebody to meet with the patients and talk about what they want. And the first option is plant-based. And if the patient doesn't want that, they offer them a second option that's also plant-based. And if they still don't want that, then they give them meat. But they've worked really hard to make the plant-based options really delicious, and also sort of culturally. In Puerto Rican neighborhoods, they do kind of Puerto Rican plant-based approaches, and in Asian neighborhood, there's a lot of there's like I had the delicious Thai vegetarian Thai curry that they did, and the sort of the punchline is that within a year they went from 1% plant-based meals to 51%, and they've reduced their emissions from their food servings by about a third. Now, again, they've got a pretty captive audience there in the hospital, but I do think that's that kind of approach will be helpful. And again, one of my mantras and all this stuff is that perfect isn't usually on the menu, but better is better than worse, and that's a lot better. You asked for 3 things that individuals can do. I always say one of my jokes is always like, I say, eat less beef, waste less food. And then number 3 would probably be eat even less beef, because I can give you a list of 50 things, but those are really the 2 big ones. I guess seriously, my third one would be give your dogs less beef. I've gotten my we have 3 annoying dogs in our house, and they are on a no beef diet, just like their dad. So those would be my 3.
I think, was it mutton was second as well, Michael? Like on that land footprint, we've got like beef is like the big baddie, and then under that was lamb.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I should have said beef and lamb, yeah, because actually our dogs used to eat lamb, and they do not anymore. They haven't complained to me about it specifically, so
I think this is more of a comment, but maybe you can talk to it too, that, considering your point about land use, it seems the best option is to switch to plant-based diet to feed more people on less land. But it's kind of a hard, that argument about veganism hasn't really worked to transform a lot of people towards more plants. I think that's the issue.
Yeah, I think it's just really hard. I mean, I always tell this story. I was just on a panel on Monday in DC with Bruce Friedrich, who used to be the head of campaigns for PETA. So he was the guy who ran around literally like throwing fake blood on models who were wearing fur. He streaked Buckingham Palace with "Go Vegan" written across his chest. He was that guy. He looked like Jesus. He had the like crazy, long scraggly beard and the long hair. And then he did that for about 20 years and realized it wasn't working. People were still eating more meat every year. And he is now the head of the Good Food Institute, which is the kind of the sort of trade group that's supporting alternative proteins, the sort of plant-based and cultivated meat and dairy, and he now looks like a tech bro, because he is a tech bro, right? He's representing a technology, and his feeling was that he spent all these years trying to get people to eat less meat, and he decided people like meat. He's just going to have to give them meat without the deforestation and the animal slaughter and the overuse of antibiotics and the potential pandemic risk. If in the same way that you're starting to see electric cars are really have become a better mousetrap. If you can get them to taste as good and and be as cheap, the hope is that will that will appeal to carnivores, and not just to the very small percentage of people around the world who for whatever reason and good for them have gone vegan or vegetarian.
And Michael, it reminds me, in your book you talked about, I found it such a surprising example that Tyson were looking at. I mean, the chicken nuggets and like really cheap hamburgers, which aren't exactly great. I don't know how much meat is actually in those things, but that they were looking at sort of a 50-50 like lab meat or mock meat plus real meat to kind of, and that in and of itself would reduce meat, at least that type of meat intake, by 50%, which I thought was super cool.
Absolutely. I was just at that event on Monday night. So they actually, it was, I should say it was sponsored by the Bezos Center. So they had so it was like a pretty luxe event and they actually they served cultivated meatballs from Mission Barns that were sort of half, well, not even half, but like there was a little bit of pork fat made from pork animal cells, pig cells, and then mixed with plant-based. There was actually a similar. There was cultivated salmon made from fish cells from wild type, but there was also, and this was the first beef that I've had in quite a few years since I started reporting on the book. But there was a company called 50/50, and their big innovation is they have burgers that are half beef and half really kind of not sort of vegetables, and I decided to try that because I do think that's a way that we can, save the world. As the CEO is there, and he told me that he has the greatest algorithm in the history of food tech, meat divided by two, and it was delicious. So yeah, that's certainly. I mean, you can imagine if McDonald's just made their burgers a third plants, or fungi, the mycoprotein, you wouldn't be able to taste the difference, and it would be, that would have an enormous impact on the climate and the planet.
And I think there's one on that same topic is a question I think you're going to love, which was, why don't we have a beef tax?
Yeah, I mean the politics suck. And I should say, like, agriculture is, I write a lot about biofuels, and in this book too, it's sort of like I bang my spoon on my high chair about it a lot. Now, granted, biofuels are only eating about a Texas worth of the earth, when agriculture is eating about 75 Texases worth of the earth. But biofuels are really terrible. I mean, it's just an awful use of good farmland. It's way worse for the climate than gasoline. And sorry, repeat the question.
Oh, it was just about why can't we have a tax on beef?
Oh, the tax, right?
But the unpopularity of it is.
But no, what I was going to say is that biofuels are a great example of how like big ag is an even more powerful force than big oil, because obviously big oil doesn't like biofuels; they would rather sell oil. I guess we were an agrarian nation once, but now only 1% of Americans farm. And I am always sort of waving my hands in the air and telling politicians that they should care more about the 99% of us who are just food consumers than the 1% who are food producers. But it's a very powerful lobby, and the barnyard, which is what the livestock lobbies are collectively known as in DC, they're just about the most powerful part of it. So, it's just you heard what I said about that pollster about people just do not like the idea of taxing meat or doing anything to their meat. It's like guns or apple pie. It's something that, or cars. People in America really love it. I will say that Denmark, which I know it's Denmark, right? Like, yeah, they're the happiest and healthiest and most wonderful country. But they passed basically the Mike Grunwald Agricultural Reform Act of 2025, and it included a tax on agricultural emissions. They also included real investments in promoting plant-based diets and promoting alternative proteins. At the same time, they are investing in a lot of these technologies to help their farmers who are already really efficient become even more efficient, but also invest in those feed additives so their dairy cows don't burp as much, and gene-edited drought-tolerant crops that they can feed to their pigs. So again, Denmark is only 6 million people. It's hardly any emissions, but it shows that it can be done, and it's something to shoot for.
That's amazing. Another question, sort of something I was wondering as well. I was thinking to ask you, like, if you had 100 million or a lot of money to invest in a solution, or where would you direct it to the most ready to scale opportunity? The transition we need. If you could choose.
Well, on the demand side, I do think, look, the idea, like alternative proteins, I think are very exciting. Everybody's sort of decided, Like, everybody got really fired up about plant-based meat a few years ago. And then, because Impossible Burgers and Beyond Burgers came out and they were way better than those old vegan hockey pucks, right, from the past. But then they weren't really better than meat, especially the Beyond ones people really haven't liked. And so then, they've done, Beyond went up to $250 a share. Now it's down to $1 a share. Everybody's talking about this as like kind of a failed experiment. But I think like it was kind of an incredible technological achievement to create meat out of plants that's 80% as good and only 50% more expensive. And I think with government help, particularly on the cultivated meat side, which has already reduced its cost like 99.9% and tastes exactly like meat, but isn't quite cheap enough yet. I think there's something where on the demand side, you can really create, I've tasted a lot of cultivated meat and it is, tastes like chicken because it's chicken. And I think that's something where, people say like, oh, there's been $3 billion invested in it. And like, what a waste. It's not even to market. I mean, there was $500 billion invested in solar panel in the solar industry just last year. And I think, in terms of the research and then the deployment, that's an area that we can really help. And then on the supply side, I think it's sort of boring and not sexy as all those other technologies that I've talked about. The most exciting supply side technology is probably gene editing, the CRISPR stuff, which hopefully will not be as controversial as GMOs because it's not transgenic. You're not taking DNA from one species and putting it in another. You're just sort of speeding up breeding, and you can do higher yields. You can do, doesn't need as much fertilizer, drought tolerant, heat tolerant, all that stuff. You can make it taste better. You can make fruits taste better so people eat more fruit. That I think is exciting. But the boring one that I think is the most ready is pasture improvements. It's not that difficult to make, a degraded pasture like 3 or 4 times more efficient. And so that it uses 1/3 or 1 to 1/4 as much land, particularly in South America. And I think, we just have to get the incentives right. And I think there can be, hopefully there'll be some investment there.
Amazing. There's some comments about, and Sue, you will like this too, because your animation shows a lot of cow burping, that there's some new devices for cows. The burps get stored and farmers can sell the methane. And then that
I hate those.
You hate it. Let's tell us more, Michael.
So it's funny. Cows. I do mention in the book, there was a study done because manure management is a real big problem. The World Resources Institute did a kind of study of like kind of a dozen things you can do to better manage manure. And the punchline is that there are like 11 of them are, for just incredibly cost effective. Some of these solutions, it's just like separating the liquid from the solids. It's like for a few cents, you can reduce emissions for like a few cents a ton. You put a little bit of acid into them, or you do a better job cleaning the barn. And then there's one that just is a terrible solution, and that's those anaerobic digesters, which are very similar to biofuels in a way. It's kind of like craft brewing biofuels, and it's just it's expensive. It's basically using land use. It creates all kinds of incentives to basically put crops and other stuff that should not go into the digester, because then of course there are all kinds of subsidies for the gas. I'm not a big fan of that one, but there is a lot that can be done with manure to help.
All right, I keep thinking about, there was a story about the nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands where the pee and the poo was mixing and causing the gas to, and actually sort of floating over to the national park, and ultimately the little birds in the nests, their legs were breaking before they could even fledge, which was so sad because they weren't getting the right nutrients from the soil. And the scientist was like, what on earth, what is causing this? And figured out it was, ultimately the nitrogen from the huge cattle herds in the Netherlands. And there were these conflicting goals for the country. One, they'd committed to the EU to protect their forests, but they can't do that if they have this nitrogen crisis from so many cows and then it became very political, trying to reduce the herds and
Yeah, well, you remember what happened. You remember
practice.
what happened where they have a great word for the nitrogen crisis in Dutch. It's like I won't even try and pronounce it, but basically they did start cracking down on nitrogen emissions, and the farmers started driving their tractors to The Hague, and trying to like shut down the country. The politics of this stuff are very difficult. Um, and the answer isn't always just to like reduce the herds, right? Because that just outsources the problem to the developing world, where often, the cattle or pork production is much less efficient, so ends up using even more land to produce it's not like that doesn't stop people from eating meat. So these are very difficult issues. Um, you know, of course, if it were easy, somebody would have solved it already. So.
And there's a question from Susan about elaborating, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on your concerns or views about limiting pesticide use and fertilizer. So the yield question.
Well, here, this is another area where I kind of get into trouble because, right? Because, there are absolutely some, fertilizer is probably, our biggest pollution problem from agriculture, both water pollution and then when it volatilizes into the air is nitrous oxide. That's a big climate problem. And some pesticides, I would caution some, can be really nasty as well for the environment and for human health. But one thing that does get lost in this kind of discussion is that fertilizers do help stuff grow, and pesticides are really good at killing pests that stop stuff from growing, and we need to grow a lot more food with a lot less land. And when you just say no chemicals or no amendments, that can be a really big problem. Now there are also real opportunities though, right? Like half of the nitrogen fertilizer that we dump on our fields in the United States and in most of the world ends up wasted, and wasted fertilizer becomes pollution. So there's like a huge incentive, because especially now that fertilizer coming through the Strait of Hormuz is up 40% in price. The same thing happened after when the war in Ukraine began. So there are definitely, the incentives are well aligned for farmers to use less. It's just that they call it like insurance nitrogen, because yields are so important to them, to their bottom line, that they're willing to overspend and over apply nitrogen, as rather than take the risk of having not enough. But my joke is always that nitrogen is like advertising. We know that half of it is wasted. We just don't know which half. But it's not entirely true. So like we do know that if you apply nitrogen in the fall rather than and so it sits on your field all winter, you end up losing a lot of it, as opposed to applying it in the spring or in the kind of split release where it kind of goes throughout the growing season. There are ways to use less of it. There are better practices. There are better products. The same goes to pesticides, where you start to get the resistance. So usually start to do a cocktail of all kinds of nasty stuff. I think you're going to start seeing more biology and less chemistry, which is great, through technology, particularly, this kind of CRISPR technology. But I do think like we shouldn't delude ourselves that farmers are going to volunteer to just stop using all this stuff because they use it for a reason.
Yeah, I keep thinking about Vaclav Smil, who wrote How the World Works, very quantitative book. He talks about how difficult it would be to really wean ourselves off nitrogen fertilizer, and that it's enabled 40-50% of the global population to be fed. So without it, nearly half the current 7.4 billion people in the world wouldn't exist. And it's sort of it's not, it's not so easy to reverse some of these things. And
there's this amazing paragraph in the Omnivore's Dilemma. I shouldn't always pick on Michael Pollan because he really is a great writer, and my book club is reading his new book on consciousness. So, congrats to Michael Pollan. He's really good. But he has in Omnivore's Dilemma, he has this whole chapter about how terrible like corn is. Like corn is horrible, it's horrible. Look at the mess it makes in all these rivers. Look at all the like terrible, they put it in Twinkies, they put it in ethanol, it's bad, fine. And then he has this like paragraph where it's sort of like, he's talking about fertilizer and how heinous it is. And he exactly that. And he says like, to be sure, like it's possible that 4 billion people on Earth wouldn't be here if it wasn't for synthetic fertilizer, and that we would have 5 times as much malnutrition as we have today. And then he goes on to again say how like terrible it is, and it's like wait, what was that? Because that thing about 4 billion people seems like a really big deal.
We have another question. It's from Scott. It's related to yield again, but how do perennial crops and tree intercropping and silvopasture figure into your thinking in terms of biodiversity, land use, and yield?
Okay, so you said a couple different ones. So like silvopasture is an example of a kind of like, you can call it regenerative or you can call it whatever, it's sort of like, sustainable. That's the kind of practice that I'm like super fired up about. I think it's great. It's like really one of those kind of no down, like very little, like it's just win-win-win. You particularly in South America, as climate change gets worse, this is planting trees in cattle pastures essentially, and it provides shade for the cows, which is very important as the world gets hotter, especially if you have kind of nitrogen fixing shrubs and trees that can actually sort of fertilize the pastures so they're more productive as well. And also, unlike these kind of soil carbon sequestration schemes that rely on kind of these, I think, sort of Rube Goldberg approaches, and then we're going to claim that there's soil in the carbon, but nobody really knows. We know that there is carbon stored in a tree because it is above ground and you can see it, and so that is awesome. And I'm a big fan of it. It can make I mentioned that my main character goes to Colombia and writes about a silvopasture project that he sees that he's wildly excited about, and he doesn't understand why this is like the best program he's ever seen, and it's only on like 15 square miles of Colombia. He's like, this should be on all ranch land. So that's silvopasture. But you said another one that the intercropping can also be can also be good. What was the first one though?
Perennial crops.
Perennial crops, yeah. So that's an example of one. So there was a story in the New York Times now a couple months ago that was sort of about how Patagonia is supporting Kernza, which is this really cool nonprofit in Kansas called the Land Institute, is trying to basically perennialize annual crops to basically make to make our crop system look more like nature, because most a natural grassland is full of perennials. And so they're trying to make a kind of perennial wheat called Kernza. And it's all, it doesn't need as much fertilizer. It has much deeper roots, so it's better for the soil. And it's all about how, in the New York Times, started on the front page, and you get 39 paragraphs in. And then you see this quote from this asshole named Micheal Grunwald. And the quote is about how, oh, by the way, Kernza's yields are 1/3 of wheat yields. So you need 3 times as much land to make the same amount of wheat, the same amount of grain. It eats 3 times as much of the earth. And one reason actually is like, is that those deep roots, it's like the crop is spending more energy to its roots than it is to making wheat. There are trade-offs with these things. And, there's a long-winded way of saying that, now I should say the Land Institute is very honest about these trade-offs. And they will say that Kernza is not ready for prime time. But I think a lot of the sort of the fans of this sort of like kinder and gentler, more natural farming just sort of hand wave that away. And so again, I think like the idea is great, but even Wes Jackson, who's now he's almost 90, he's the sort of founder of the Land Institute. He will tell you that this is like, he's like, this might take another century. And another century, this could be a really great solution, but right now it doesn't really feel like one.
Yep. We have Dr. Brian von Hertzen had a comment about fertilizer, saying it's not so much about how much fertilizer is applied, but what the plant does with it and how efficiently it is used.
Yeah, I mean, it's right. I mean, the idea is getting it into the plant, right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little, but these farmers dump a lot of fertilizer, and the idea, they want to get it into the plant, but a lot of it washes into the river or into the stream, and some of it volatilizes into the air as nitrous oxide. And so the goal is to get more of it into the plant, and then hopefully, you know, we'll edit the plants to use fertilizer more efficiently and maybe need less fertilizer, or who knows, maybe, figure out ways to fix their own nitrogen, even though they're not naturally leguminous plants. So I think, these are exciting possibilities. But as I think Wendy, or maybe it was Sue who mentioned earlier, like, we don't have indefinite amounts of time to solve these problems. We would like to, these next few decades are going to be really crucial, and some of these long-term solutions, while really promising, they can't be the whole solution. We can't just say like, oh well, we don't need to do X because in 30 years we're going to have a better Kernza, or we're going to have better plants that don't need as much fertilizer. I always find that the people who are saying that usually are not working on that. Like people are like, we don't need to make more food, we just need to stop wasting so much. My next question is always like, are you working on food waste? It's like, no, somebody else should solve that problem. It's,
Maybe I think it's a great sort of perhaps final question. It is interesting, Climate Week. You don't see a lot of talks about animal agriculture or about biodiversity on the agenda. So I think this has been a really meaningful conversation. Raghav asked, like, what other people on the chat can share too their thoughts, but what other podcasts, organizations, or YouTube channels do you recommend, Michael, that you listen to keep engaging with this topic?
oh wow. Well, of course, everybody needs to read my book. I mean,
Yeah,
I will
exactly.
say,
Gotta read the whole book. Yep.
I will say it's frustrating, right? Because like 3% of climate finance right now is directed to food and agriculture. And sorry, but like an awful lot of that 3% is dedicated towards this, agroecology, regenerative stuff that, a lot of good things about it for soil, for erosion control, for, for like lots of good stuff, but not really proven as a climate solution generally. So I do think there's, just as a society, I think the focus needs to change. I try and write about this. I'm a contributor to the New York Times, is I think trying to do a little bit better on this stuff. But I find, there's like Sentient Media, for example, which they cover industrial agriculture, but it's kind of a journalism organization started from kind of vegan activists, but they're just great journalists, I think, so that's the example. I also write for climate, for Canary Media, which covers climate issues, Heat Map. They do a very nice job. It's, I kind of wrote this book because I felt like people weren't grappling with this issue enough. And there have been studies, I think it's something like 5% of climate stories mention food and agriculture. So, we got a long way to go.
Yeah. One of my other favorite authors, other than Michael, is George Monbiot writes about land sharing, land sparing, more Europe focused, but this issue as well. His book's called Regenesis. But actually a very interesting question from Scott. If we could have it all, how could we increase the yield of a given area of land and increase biodiversity? I mean, can you do all those things at once? Agroecology, perhaps, and intercropping and silvopasture, like, or perhaps that example you saw, Michael, that had really successfully done more regenerative farming but kept the yield the same. Was biodiversity better there too? I'm sure it was.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they increased their yields tremendously. I guess I would say like there are these kind of win-win solutions. CRISPR I think really is the opportunity to provide a lot of them. But like I do think we tend to, when we think about, biodiversity in agriculture, it's sort of like the biodiversity of the microbiome or or like how many birds landed on this, on my farm this year. And I do, I'm not hand waving that away, but I do think the real biodiversity is in nature. And so like the more we can do to preserve nature, and right now, like, this isn't a question of where like agriculture is static. Like agriculture is growing. We need to stop that growth because it is growing into nature. It's not growing into parking lots, So I really think, the kind of restoration work that Wendy does is like, that's the goal. That's the rewilding is like where you see like a huge explosion of biodiversity, but we can't do that as long as agriculture is continuing to expand all over the world. It's like, and as long as there's the demand for land intensive foods and agriculture is not productive enough, agriculture is gonna keep finding its way into nature, like kind of like a river going around rocks. So I do think like on-farm biodiversity is important, and it can be again, better is better than worse. But on-farm biodiversity at the expense of nature is generally a bad trade-off. I'm really focused on trying to prevent the destruction of nature in the first place and then try to restore some of what's already been overrun.
I think that's an amazing place to end. And thank you so much, Michael, for joining us and really driving this conversation. And then to everybody who joined us as well virtually for San Francisco Climate Week, and Sue. Thank you, Sue. Yeah, we will hopefully, if we did it right, we recorded it, we'll send it out to everybody. But really great, I think, to have biodiversity and sustainable agriculture, or Michael, how this topic, how do we stop eating the earth, on the agenda, because it's not talked about enough. So thank you again so much, Michael and Sue. Have a great day out there.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.